Billionaire Fiancée punched the maid at a luxury party. Nobody expected the billionaire to walk in. "Pick that up," Isabella hissed, "before I make sure you never work in this city again." Grace knelt on the marble floor, gathering the shattered pieces of a crystal glass with trembling hands, red wine soaking into her purple uniform. The entire ballroom had gone silent. 200 guests. Champagne frozen mid-air. Nobody moved. Then Isabella raised her hand. The slap echoed through the grand hall like a gunshot. But what nobody in that room knew, what Isabella herself didn't know, was that the man walking through the front doors at that exact moment had spent the last 6 months waiting for a night exactly like this one. And when he saw what happened next, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Welcome back, family. If you're new here, grab a cup of coffee and get comfortable, because tonight's story is one of the most emotional, twist-filled journeys we've ever told. This is a story about love, greed, betrayal, and the kind of redemption that can only come after someone loses everything that ever mattered to them. Before we begin, tell us in the comments what country are you watching from tonight. Now, let's step into the world of the Calloway family, where one single night at a luxury party would change 4 lives forever. She used to give her last dollar to strangers. Now she couldn't remember the last time she smiled at someone who wasn't rich. Isabella Hartwell had not always been cruel. 10 years ago, she was a 22-year-old nursing student in Dayton, Ohio, working double shifts at a diner to pay her tuition. Back then, she gave free coffee to homeless veterans on cold mornings. She cried during hospital shifts when patients passed away, holding their hands even when no family came. Her mother, Carol Hartwell, used to say, "Bella has the biggest heart in this whole town." Everything changed the night she met Nathaniel Calloway. Nathaniel, Nate to the people who actually knew him, was the heir to Calloway Industries, a real estate and hospitality empire worth over $4 billion. He'd wandered into that same Dayton diner during a business trip, exhausted, hungry, and completely anonymous. Isabella hadn't recognized him. She'd simply refilled his coffee 3 times and told him, unprompted, that his tie didn't match his shirt. He laughed for the first time in months. 6 months later they were engaged. At first, Isabella tried to stay grounded. She insisted on doing her own laundry in the Calloway mansion. She learned the names of every staff member, from the groundskeepers to the chefs. She would sit in the kitchen with the household staff during her breaks, sharing stories, laughing at their jokes, refusing to let money change who she was. But the world she'd entered had other plans for her. Nate's mother, Diane Calloway, made her disapproval of Isabella's common background known from day one. "She'll embarrass this family," Diane whispered to her sister at a charity gala, loud enough for Isabella to hear. Isabella's own so-called friends, women she met through Nate's social circle, began filling her head with a different kind of wisdom. "You're a Calloway now, Bella. Act like it. Why are you being so friendly with the help? It's beneath you. People will only respect you if they fear you a little." Slowly, painfully, something inside Isabella began to shift. She started correcting her accent. She stopped visiting her mother in Ohio as often, embarrassed by the modest house she grew up in. She replaced her old friends with new ones who complimented her jewelry but never asked about her heart. Within 3 years, the girl who once cried over a dying stranger's hand had become a woman who could walk past a crying child without slowing her pace. Nate noticed the change too, though he told himself it was simply growing into her role. He was busy, running 3 companies across 2 continents, rarely home for more than a few days at a time. He didn't see the small cruelties. He didn't see her scream at a driver for being 4 minutes late, or fire a housekeeper for folding towels the wrong way, or humiliate a waiter in front of investors because he'd forgotten to remove the ice from her water. He didn't see any of it. Until his grandmother, Eleanor Calloway, the only person in the family Isabella hadn't managed to charm or intimidate, pulled him aside one evening. "Nathaniel," Eleanor said, her voice steady but heavy with concern. "I've lived 83 years, and I have never met a person who changes as quickly and as completely as that girl has. You need to see who she really is before you marry her. Not who she pretends to be in front of you." Nate wanted to defend Isabella. He wanted to believe the woman who once told him his tie didn't match his shirt was still somewhere inside her. But a small, quiet doubt had already been planted. And 3 weeks later, Nate made a decision that would set the entire tragic, twisted, unforgettable night of the gala into motion. A decision so quiet, so secret, that not even his own mother knew about it. He picked up his phone and called an old childhood friend. Someone he trusted with his life. Someone named Grace. "I need a favor," Nate said. "And I need you to trust me completely." What Nate didn't know yet was that this single phone call would soon collide with the biggest party of the year, and expose a truth that would leave 200 guests speechless, break his mother's heart, and force Isabella to face the woman she had become. The gala was 3 weeks away, and Grace had already said yes. Nobody suspected the new maid. That was exactly the point. Grace Whitfield had known Nathaniel Calloway since they were both 9 years old, back when the Calloway family still lived in a modest brownstone in Boston, long before their fortune multiplied into billions. Grace's father, James Whitfield, had been the Calloway family's driver for over 20 years. A quiet, loyal man who'd once pulled young Nathaniel out of a burning car after a highway accident, saving his life at the cost of 2 broken ribs and a permanent limp. The Calloways never forgot that debt. James was given a pension, a home, and Nate's eternal gratitude. Grace, his daughter, grew up practically as Nate's little sister, inseparable during summers, bonded by something deeper than social class. Grace had gone on to build her own life. She earned a master's degree in social work, spent years running a non-profit that helped domestic workers fight against wage theft and mistreatment across the country. She understood better than almost anyone what it looked like when power corrupted good people, and what it looked like when the powerless were made invisible. So when Nate called her, voice tight with worry, and asked her to work undercover as a temporary maid inside his own household for 3 weeks leading up to the engagement gala, Grace didn't hesitate. "I need to know who Isabella really is," Nate had said. "Not the version she shows me. The real one." Grace understood immediately. She'd seen this story before, dozens of times in dozens of homes through her work. Money did strange things to people. Sometimes it revealed character. Other times it manufactured a new one entirely, built on fear, image, and control. She agreed on one condition. "If I do this and I see something wrong, really wrong, I'm not going to just report it to you quietly, Nate. I'm going to make sure it's addressed." Nate agreed. Grace arrived at the Calloway estate under a fake resume, hired officially through the household staffing agency, with zero indication of her real identity. She wore the same lavender uniform as the other maids. She scrubbed floors, ironed linens, carried trays of champagne through hallways lined with priceless art. And she watched. What she witnessed in those 3 weeks broke her heart. She watched Isabella scream at an elderly housekeeper named Rosa for accidentally chipping a porcelain vase, threatening to have her deported despite Rosa being a legal citizen for over 15 years. She watched Isabella accidentally spill coffee on a junior assistant's blouse and laugh about it with her friends afterward. She watched Isabella instruct the kitchen staff to prepare separate, cheaper meals for the household employees while insisting on imported ingredients for herself, because standards matter, and some people simply don't understand quality. But Grace also saw something else, something that complicated the picture exactly the way real life always does. She saw Isabella, late one night, sitting alone in the garden, staring at an old photograph of herself and her mother from years ago, tears streaking down her face. She saw her quietly slip an envelope of cash into Rosa's coat pocket the next morning, an anonymous apology neither would ever speak of. She saw brief, fleeting moments where the old Isabella, the diner waitress with the enormous heart, seemed to claw her way back to the surface before disappearing again beneath the weight of expectation and fear. Grace began to understand that Isabella wasn't a monster. She was a woman drowning in a world that had taught her cruelty was armor, and she didn't know how to take it off anymore. Still, understanding someone's pain didn't excuse the pain they caused others. As the gala approached, tension inside the mansion grew unbearable. Diane Calloway had spared no expense. 300 guests, a live orchestra, ice sculptures flown in from Norway, and a guest list that included senators, celebrities, and half of Forbes' billionaire list. The engagement announcement was set to happen at midnight, in front of everyone who mattered in Nate's world. Grace had been assigned to serve drinks near the main staircase that night, positioned deliberately, close enough to Isabella to see everything. Nate arrived late from a business trip in Chicago, his flight delayed by severe weather. He texted Isabella, "Landing in 20 minutes. Save me a dance. I love you." Isabella smiled reading it, a genuine soft smile that Grace hadn't seen from her in 3 weeks. For a moment, Grace almost believed there was hope for her. Then, at 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before Nate's car was scheduled to pull into the estate, disaster struck. Grace, carrying a tray of champagne glasses across the ballroom floor, was gently pushed from behind by a careless guest reaching for a cocktail. She stumbled. A single glass slipped and shattered against Isabella's designer red gown, wine splashing across the delicate beadwork Isabella had waited 4 months to receive from Milan. The room went quiet. Isabella's face twisted, not with the composed grace expected of a future Calloway, but with raw, uncontrolled fury. "Do you have any idea what this dress cost?" she screamed, loud enough for the orchestra to stop mid-song. "Are you even capable of doing your job correctly? Or is basic competence too much to ask from someone like you?" Grace, still in character, still undercover, dropped to her knees immediately, apologizing, gathering the broken glass with bare hands despite the sharp edges cutting into her fingers. It wasn't enough. Isabella raised her hand, and 300 guests watched in stunned silence as Isabella Hartwell struck Grace Whitfield across the face, hard enough to draw blood from her lip. At that exact moment, the grand front doors of the Calloway estate swung open. Nate had arrived early, and he had seen everything. For 6 months, Nate had wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. In 6 seconds he got his answer. Time seemed to stop. Nate stood frozen at the entrance of the ballroom, still in his travel coat, briefcase in hand, staring at the scene in front of him. 280 guests turned to follow his gaze. From Nate to Isabella, to the maid kneeling on the floor with blood on her lip. Diane Calloway gasped audibly. Eleanor, seated near the orchestra, closed her eyes as if she already knew, deep down, that this moment had been inevitable. Isabella's face went pale. "Nate, she dropped a tray, my dress, You hit her," Nate said quietly. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The silence in the room made every word carry like thunder. "In front of 300 people. You hit her. Nate, please let me explain." "Explain what exactly?" Nate's voice cracked, not with anger alone, but with a grief that had been building for months. "Explain why the woman I proposed to a year ago, the woman who once told a stranger in a diner that his tie didn't match his shirt because she genuinely cared enough to notice, just struck a member of my staff hard enough to draw blood?" Isabella opened her mouth, but no words came. Nate crossed the ballroom floor and knelt beside Grace, gently helping her up, checking the cut on her lip with visible concern. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Grace nodded, though her eyes were glistening, not from the pain of the slap, but from the weight of what she was about to do. "Nate," Grace said quietly, just loud enough for those closest to hear, "there's something you need to know. Something I need to tell you. And I think it's time everyone heard it." Isabella's confusion turned to dawning horror as she looked more closely at the maid in front of her, recognizing for the first time a face she'd seen in old photographs on Nate's phone years ago. Childhood photo. A little girl standing next to a young Nathaniel Calloway outside a modest Boston brownstone. "Grace." Isabella whispered. Grace Whitfield. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Diane Calloway's hand flew to her mouth. Even Eleanor, usually composed, leaned forward in her seat. Nate exhaled slowly, the moment he'd been dreading and preparing for finally arriving. Isabella, he said, Grace isn't a maid. She's the daughter of the man who saved my life when I was 9 years old. She has a master's degree, runs a non-profit protecting workers' rights across this country, and I asked her, personally 3 weeks ago, to work undercover in this house. The room erupted into hushed, shocked whispers. Why? Isabella asked, her voice trembling, though somewhere beneath the shock, understanding was already dawning. Because my grandmother told me something I didn't want to hear, Nate said. She told me that people show their truest selves not to those with power over them, but to those they believe have none. I needed to know who you really were, Isabella. Not the woman who smiles at galas and charms my business partners. The woman underneath. And tonight, in front of everyone, I finally saw her. Isabella's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Tears spilled down her face. Not performative tears, not tears meant to manipulate a room full of witnesses, but raw, broken tears of a woman confronting exactly who she had become. Nate, I don't even recognize myself anymore, she whispered. I used to be someone good. I used to be someone who cared. I don't know when that stopped. I don't know when I became this person. Grace, still holding a napkin to her bleeding lip, stepped forward. For what it's worth, she said quietly, loud enough for the room to hear. I don't think you're evil, Isabella. I watched you for 3 weeks. I saw the good still buried in there. The money you slipped Rosa after you humiliated her. The tears you cried alone in the garden over your mother. Think you got lost. But getting lost doesn't mean you can't find your way back. The room was utterly silent. Nate turned to face the crowd. Senators, celebrities, billionaires, all watching his most private heartbreak unfold in public. There will be no engagement announcement tonight, he said. His voice steady despite the devastation clearly written across his face. I'm deeply sorry for what everyone has witnessed. This gala is over. As security began quietly ushering stunned guests toward the exits, Diane Calloway rushed to her son's side, while Eleanor moved instead toward Isabella, who stood frozen and humiliated in the center of the ballroom, mascara streaked down her cheeks, designer dress ruined, engagement dreams shattered in front of the very society she'd spent years desperately trying to impress. What would you do? The narrator's voice seemed to whisper across the silent room. If you were standing in Isabella's place right now? Losing everything is sometimes the only way to find out who you really are. The weeks following the gala were the darkest of Isabella's life. News of the incident spread rapidly, first through whispered gossip among New York and Connecticut's elite social circles, then, inevitably, through social media, where a guest's phone footage of the slap had been posted online and viewed over 11 million times within 72 hours. Headlines called her the cruel fiancée, the Calloway scandal, and worse. Brands that had once courted her for sponsorships dropped her overnight. Friends who had spent years whispering poison into her ear about standards and reputation now refused to return her calls, terrified of being associated with the controversy. Nate moved out of the shared penthouse the day after the gala. He didn't shout. He didn't demand an apology. He simply packed a bag and left a note. I still believe there's good in you somewhere, Isabella. But I can't keep pretending I don't see what this life has turned you into. I hope, for your sake and not mine, that you find your way back to who you used to be. Isabella spent the first week in complete isolation, refusing to leave her apartment, staring at her reflection and barely recognizing the woman looking back. The designer clothes, the jewelry, the perfectly maintained image. None of it meant anything anymore. Stripped of Nate's protection and society's approval, she was forced, for the first time in years, to sit alone with herself. It was her mother, Carol, who finally broke through. Carol drove 8 hours from Dayton after seeing the video online, arriving at Isabella's apartment unannounced, refusing to leave until her daughter opened the door. When Isabella finally did, collapsing into her mother's arms, the dam of guilt and grief she'd been holding back for years finally broke. "I don't know who I am anymore, Mom," Isabella sobbed. "I hurt so many people. I became exactly the kind of person I used to hate." Carol held her daughter tightly, the same way she had when Isabella was a little girl. "The daughter I raised is still in there, Bella. I saw her tonight crying in my arms. That girl never left. She was just buried under a lot of noise for a long time." Over the following months, Isabella made a decision that shocked everyone who thought they knew her, including herself. She reached out to Grace. Not through lawyers, not through a carefully worded public apology drafted by a publicist, but personally in a handwritten letter, asking simply to meet and apologize face to face. Grace, true to the compassion that defined her, agreed. Their meeting was tense at first, painful and raw. Isabella apologized not just for the slap, but for years of cruelty toward people she'd once genuinely respected. She admitted, through tears, how the fear of losing her place in Nate's world had slowly poisoned every value she once held dear. Grace listened without interrupting. When Isabella finished, Grace said something that would stay with her forever. "Apologies mean something only when they change your actions afterward. Words are easy, Isabella. What you do next is what will actually tell me, and everyone else, who you really are." It was a challenge. And Isabella, for the first time in years, chose to rise to meet it. She quietly began volunteering, unpaid and unpublicized, at a domestic workers' advocacy organization. Coincidentally, one of the very organizations Grace's nonprofit partnered with. She spent months learning about wage theft, workplace abuse, and the daily struggles of the very people she had once treated as beneath her notice. She personally tracked down Rosa, the housekeeper she'd humiliated over the broken vase, and not only apologized in person but helped fund Rosa's daughter's college tuition anonymously, refusing any public credit. Slowly, painstakingly, the old Isabella, the diner waitress who gave free coffee to strangers and held dying patients' hands, began to resurface. Meanwhile, Nate watched from a distance, cautious but unable to entirely let go of the hope his grandmother had once threatened to extinguish. Eleanor, who had witnessed the entire transformation, finally spoke to her grandson one quiet evening on the estate's back porch. "She's changing, Nathaniel," Eleanor said. "Real change, not performance. I've watched people fake goodness for years in our world. This isn't that." "How do you know?" Nate asked. Eleanor smiled softly. "Because she's doing the hard work when no one's watching. That's the only kind of change that's ever real. True redemption isn't asking to be forgiven. It's becoming someone worth forgiving." 1 year after the gala that shattered her world, Isabella stood in a very different room. Not a ballroom filled with senators and billionaires, but a modest community center in the Bronx, where she now worked full-time as a program coordinator for domestic workers' rights, helping families navigate unfair labor practices, wage theft, and workplace abuse, the very issues she once would have dismissed without a second thought. She had changed her last name back to Hartwell after ending things amicably, and with mutual respect with Nate. Their romantic relationship never resumed. Too much had happened, too much trust had been broken, but something rarer and perhaps more meaningful had grown in its place: genuine friendship and mutual admiration. Grace had become one of Isabella's closest friends, the two women now co-leading workshops together for domestic workers across 3 states, sharing their story publicly. Not to seek sympathy, but to help others recognize the same warning signs of losing themselves to greed, status, and fear that Isabella had lived through. At a public event nearly 18 months after the infamous gala, Isabella stood in front of an audience for the first time to share her story openly. "I used to believe that money and status would make me safe," she told the crowd, her voice steady, stripped of the arrogance that once defined her. "Instead, it made me cruel. It made me forget the person I actually was. I hurt people who never deserved it, people who worked hard, who trusted me, who I dismissed simply because I was afraid of losing my place in a world that was never really mine to begin with. She paused, eyes finding her mother in the front row, tears in Carol's eyes matching her own. "I'm not asking anyone here to forgive me," Isabella continued. "I'm asking you to watch what I do from this day forward, and judge me by that instead. Because I've learned that real change isn't a single apology. It's 1,000 small choices made every single day to be the person you know you're capable of being." The audience rose in a standing ovation, not for a billionaire's fiancée, not for a viral scandal survivor, but for a woman who had done the hardest thing imaginable, rebuilding her character from nothing in full public view, with no guarantee anyone would ever forgive her. Nate, sitting quietly near the back of the room, smiled, not with romantic longing, but with the quiet pride of someone who had taken an enormous risk on an old friend's advice, and watched it lead, eventually, to genuine transformation. After the event, Grace found Isabella backstage, embracing her tightly. "Your father would be proud of you," Isabella whispered, referring to James Whitfield, Grace's father, who had passed away peacefully just months earlier, having lived long enough to witness the beginning of Isabella's redemption. "He always said everyone deserves a chance to become who they're meant to be," Grace replied, smiling through tears. "You just needed someone to hold up a mirror." As for Eleanor Calloway, she lived to see both Nate and Isabella, no longer engaged, but forever connected by the lesson that single gala night had taught them both: build meaningful, purpose-driven lives. Nate eventually restructured Callaway Industries' entire hospitality division to include fair wage guarantees and worker protection policies across every property the company owned, directly inspired by everything he'd learned that fateful night. And Isabella, the woman once known across social media as the cruel fiancée, became over time something far more powerful, living proof that people are not permanently defined by their worst moment, but by what they choose to do after it. The little girl who once gave free coffee to strangers in a Dayton diner had found her way home again. Not to wealth, not to status, but to herself. Just when Isabella thought her past was behind her, one phone call threatened to undo everything she had rebuilt. 2 years after the gala, Isabella's life had settled into a rhythm she never thought she'd find again. Quiet, purposeful, honest. She had her own small apartment in Queens, paid for entirely with her own salary. She had her work at the community center. She had her mother's pride, Grace's friendship, and something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Then the call came. A national news producer wanted to do a televised "Where Are They Now?" segment on the viral gala scandal. They tracked down old footage, old headlines, old comments calling her cruel, heartless, a gold digger who got exactly what she deserved. They wanted Isabella to sit for an interview, and they wanted Diane Calloway, too, who had never spoken publicly about that night. Isabella's first instinct was to refuse. She had spent 2 years quietly rebuilding, away from cameras, away from judgment. The thought of reopening that wound on national television, in front of millions of strangers who only knew her as the cruel fiancée, terrified her. "You don't owe them anything," her mother told her over the phone. "You've already done the work. You don't need an audience to prove it." But Grace, when Isabella called her that night, offered a different perspective. "You don't owe the internet an interview," Grace said carefully. "But think about how many people are exactly where you were 2 years ago, trapped in a life that's slowly turning them into someone they don't recognize, and too ashamed to admit it. Your story could reach them. That's not about you anymore, Bella. That's about who you could help." Isabella sat with that thought for 3 sleepless nights. In the end she said yes, but only on her own terms. No production company script. No dramatized reenactments. Just her, sitting across from a journalist, telling the truth without flinching. What she didn't expect was Diane Calloway showing up on set the same day. The 2 women hadn't spoken since the gala. Diane had been the one person who disapproved of Isabella from the very beginning, the one whose whispered comments about common backgrounds had planted the first toxic seed. Backstage, waiting for their segments, an uncomfortable silence stretched between them until Diane finally spoke. "I owe you an apology too," Diane said quietly, not meeting Isabella's eyes. "I spent years telling you who you needed to become to belong in this family. I never once stopped to ask if the person you already were was good enough. Maybe if I hadn't pushed so hard, none of this would have happened." Isabella felt something unexpected. Not vindication but grief. Grief for the version of herself that might have existed if she'd had someone in that world telling her the truth instead of feeding her fear. "We can't go back," Isabella finally said. "But we can be honest about it now. That's more than most people ever get the chance to do." The interview aired 3 weeks later. Isabella didn't make excuses. She described in raw detail how greed and fear had eroded her character piece by piece, how a room full of people who valued image over integrity had slowly convinced her that cruelty was strength. She talked about Rosa, about the anonymous envelope of guilt money, about the night she hit Grace in front of 300 people and felt something break inside herself that she didn't know how to fix. And she talked about the long, unglamorous work of rebuilding, the volunteering, the apologies, the years of showing up quietly when no cameras were watching. The reaction stunned everyone, including Isabella herself. Instead of renewed mockery, the internet responded with something far more powerful: recognition. Thousands of comments poured in from people admitting they'd seen pieces of themselves in her story. People who'd let ambition or fear or the wrong friendships slowly reshape who they were. Messages arrived from strangers thanking her for putting words to something they'd never had the courage to say about themselves. One comment, from a woman in Texas, stayed with Isabella long after the segment aired. "I fired someone last year for a mistake that wasn't even her fault, because I was scared of looking weak in front of my boss. Watching this made me call her and apologize. Thank you for being honest." For the first time, Isabella understood that her worst moment, the moment that had once defined her entire public identity, could also become the thing that helped someone else avoid the same mistake. But not everyone was ready to forgive so easily. A week after the interview aired, Isabella received a message that made her stomach drop. It was from Rosa's daughter, Camila, the young woman whose college tuition Isabella had quietly funded 2 years earlier. "I need to talk to you," the message read. "It's about my mom. Please call me." Isabella's hand shook as she dialed the number, fear gripping her chest. Rosa had been kind enough to forgive her privately, kind enough to accept help she never should have needed to accept in the first place. Had something happened? Had the old wound reopened now that Isabella's past was splashed across national television again? Camila picked up on the second ring, her voice thick with emotion. "My mom saw the interview," Camila said. "She's been crying for an hour." "Not bad crying, Isabella. She wants to see you. She says there's something she never told you, something she's wanted to say for 2 years." Isabella agreed to visit the next day, her heart pounding with uncertainty, unaware that what Rosa was about to tell her would reveal a truth about that gala night, and about herself, that she never could have imagined. Some truths take years to surface. And once they do, they change everything. Rosa's apartment in the Bronx was small but warm, filled with family photos and the smell of fresh bread. When Isabella arrived, Rosa greeted her not with the guarded politeness of their last meeting, but with a tight, tearful embrace. "Sit," Rosa said, guiding her to the kitchen table. "I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago." Isabella sat, bracing herself for something painful. "The night of the party," Rosa began, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "Before the vase, before any of it, I overheard something. Diane Calloway talking to her sister in the hallway, weeks before the gala. She said she was going to make sure you showed your true colors before the engagement was official. She said she'd been quietly encouraging your friends, the ones always in your ear about status, about image, to push harder, to make you colder. She wanted Nathaniel to see it and call off the wedding herself, without ever having to say a word against you directly. Isabella felt the air leave her lungs. I didn't say anything back then, Rosa continued, guilt washing over her face. I was afraid. I needed my job. I told myself it wasn't my business. But watching you on that interview, hearing you take full responsibility for everything, blaming no one but yourself, I couldn't carry this secret anymore. You changed because of choices you made, yes. But you were also being pushed, manipulated, set up to fail by people who wanted you to fail. Isabella sat in stunned silence, a flood of emotions crashing over her at once. Anger, betrayal, but also, unexpectedly, relief. Relief that the person she'd been wasn't entirely a product of her own weakness. Relief that even in her darkest chapter, forces beyond her control had been working against her. But alongside the relief came a harder realization. It doesn't change what I did, Isabella finally said, more to herself than to Rosa. Diane may have pushed me toward the cliff, but I'm the one who chose to keep walking toward it, every single day for years. Hurt you. I hurt so many people. Knowing why doesn't erase that. Rosa reached across the table and took her hand. No, it doesn't erase it. But it explains it. And understanding why someone breaks doesn't mean they don't deserve credit for putting themselves back together. Isabella left Rosa's apartment that evening with her mind spinning. She didn't confront Diane. She'd already had her moment of honesty with her on set, and dragging up old manipulation wouldn't rebuild anything further. Instead, she chose something quieter, something that mattered more. She let it go, folding the truth into her understanding of her own story without letting it become an excuse. Months later, at the opening of a new wing at the community center, funded, coincidentally, by an anonymous donation that everyone quietly suspected came from Eleanor Calloway, Isabella stood at a podium once more, this time not explaining her past, but celebrating the future. Rosa was in the audience. Camila, now a graduate, sat beside her. Grace stood near the front, beaming. Even Nate attended, standing quietly near the back exactly as he had at her first public speech. Still her friend, still in his own way, proud of the person she'd chosen to become. 3 years ago, Isabella told the crowd, I was a person defined by fear. Fear of not belonging, fear of losing status, fear of being seen as anything less than perfect. That fear turned me into someone I never wanted to be. But I've learned something in the years since. The people who push us toward our worst selves don't get to decide who we become afterward. We do. Every day. One choice at a time. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, the workers she'd once dismissed, now her colleagues and friends, the family she'd nearly lost, now closer than ever, the mother who never gave up on her, sitting proudly in the front row. I can't undo the pain I caused, she said, her voice steady and clear. But I can spend the rest of my life making sure it meant something. That's the only kind of redemption that's real. The crowd rose to their feet. And somewhere in that applause, the little girl who once poured free coffee for strangers in a Dayton diner finally, fully came home. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful emotional stories, and tell us in the comments. Could you have forgiven Isabella the way Rosa and Grace did? Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. We'll see you in the next story.